You're a German infantry officer in October 1942, standing at the edge of a frozen forest outside Stalingrad. The morning air bites at your exposed skin, a cold so profound it seems to seep into your bones despite the heavy wool uniform. Your breath plumes in white clouds that quickly dissipate in the still air. The forest before you stands silent, birch and pine trees stark against the gray October sky, their branches bare except for a few stubborn leaves that rattle occasionally in a breeze you can't feel on your skin. Your regiment, 3,000 men, supported by artillery, mortars, and machine gun sections, has been ordered to clear a pocket of Soviet resistance and secure a road junction before nightfall. Intelligence says maybe 40 defenders are left, maybe fewer. The forward scouts haven't reported contact. The air is still. You give the order to advance, and then nothing happens. Not nothing in the sense of silence. Nothing in the sense that your lead companies move forward into the tree line and then they just stop. Radio traffic becomes frantic. Casualties are being called in. Officers are dying. But nobody sees the enemy. Nobody hears massed fire, just single cracks, sharp, surgical. And then another man drops, and another. You send in reinforcements. They stop too. You call for mortars. The barrage walks through empty forest. When your men advance again, the same thing happens. One shot, one man. No return fire visible, no muzzle flash, no movement. By the time the sun sets, your regiment has taken 160 casualties, lost 11 officers, and gained exactly nothing. You still don't control the road. You still haven't seen the enemy. And somewhere in that frozen, silent forest, 24 Soviet snipers are reloading. This is the story of one of the most lopsided defensive actions of the Second World War, a story about what happens when ordinary soldiers are turned into hunters, when psychological terror becomes as effective as firepower, and when a handful of marksmen with iron discipline can hold back an entire combined arms formation. This is about the October 1942 defense of a nameless forest pocket near the Orlovka salient, north of Stalingrad. It's about how the Red Army's sniper doctrine, forged in desperation, refined through catastrophic losses, and executed by men and women who understood that survival meant never being seen, created a force multiplier so devastating that entire Wehrmacht units refused to advance into certain sectors. It's about the 24 who made a regiment stop. The sniper as a mass tactical element in the Soviet military didn't begin as some grand doctrinal innovation. It began as an act of survival. By late 1941, the Red Army was hemorrhaging manpower at a rate that defied comprehension. Entire divisions were being encircled and destroyed. Weapons production couldn't keep pace with losses. Artillery pieces were being abandoned because there were no tractors to move them and no shells to feed them. Infantry companies that should have numbered 120 men were going into battle with 40. And yet, the Wehrmacht kept coming. In that calculus of desperation, the sniper became valuable not because of ideology or propaganda, but because of mathematics. One trained rifleman with a scoped Mosin Nagant could achieve what 10 regular soldiers couldn't. Selective removal of officers, machine gunners, radiomen, forward observers, anyone whose death would degrade enemy command and cohesion. The sniper didn't hold ground. The sniper made the enemy afraid to take it. The development of Soviet sniper training programs was itself a remarkable story of adaptation and innovation. The first centralized sniper schools had been established in the late 1930s, but they were small, elite programs designed primarily for competition shooting and military demonstration teams. It wasn't until the catastrophic losses of 1941 that these programs were dramatically expanded. The Soviet High Command realized that with industrial capacity strained and manpower losses mounting, they needed to develop low-cost, high-impact force multipliers. By early 1942, the Red Army had established a network of sniper schools across the Urals and Siberia, far from the front lines where training could proceed without interruption. The curriculum was intensive and brutally practical. Recruits, many of them women and teenagers not eligible for conventional combat roles, underwent 3 months of training that covered marksmanship, fieldcraft, camouflage, observation, and psychological conditioning. They learned to calculate wind drift and bullet drop, to read terrain for advantageous firing positions, to move silently through varied environments, and to remain motionless for hours in extreme weather. What set the Soviet training apart was its emphasis on the psychological aspects of sniping. Instructors taught students not just how to shoot, but how to think like a hunter. They learned patience, observation, and the ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. Most importantly, they learned to suppress the natural human aversion to killing another human being at close range. Through a combination of ideological conditioning, psychological techniques, and repetitive practice, the schools produced soldiers who could look through a scope, see a human face, and squeeze the trigger without hesitation. The weapons they used were simple but effective. The Mosin Nagant 9130 rifle, originally designed in 1891, was modified with a scope, typically either a 4x PE model or the simpler 3.5x PU that would become standard later in the war. The rifles were hand-selected for accuracy from regular production lines, with barrels carefully inspected and triggers tuned to a crisp pull. Ammunition was specially selected, with each sniper testing multiple batches to find the lot that performed best in their particular rifle. Soviet sniper doctrine in 1942 was built around several core principles that were completely alien to how Western armies used marksmen. First, snipers were never employed individually. They operated in pairs, shooter and spotter, sometimes in teams of 4 or 6, coordinated at the platoon level. Second, they were trained not to take spectacular long shots, but to take guaranteed shots at ranges under 400 meters where a hit was nearly certain. Third, they were trained to move constantly, never firing more than 2 or 3 rounds from one position, never leaving a visible trace. Fourth, they were integrated directly into defensive plans as area denial weapons. A sniper pair wasn't just supporting the infantry. The sniper pair was the infantry, holding a sector that might otherwise require a platoon. This doctrine represented a significant departure from traditional military thinking. Most armies of the period treated snipers as specialized support elements, skilled marksmen who could take out high-value targets at long range, but who operated independently of the main force. The Soviet approach, by contrast, made snipers an integral part of the defensive network, with overlapping fields of fire and coordinated movement patterns that turned a sector of terrain into a deadly killing zone. By mid-1942, the Red Army had graduated tens of thousands of snipers from centralized schools, many of them women. Women made up nearly a third of Soviet sniper graduates by the end of the war, not as a propaganda stunt, but because they were often better shots, more patient, less prone to bravado, and smaller, easier to conceal. The most famous names, Lyudmila Pavlichenko with 309 confirmed kills, Rosa Shanina with 59, Nina Lobkovskaya, who commanded an all-female sniper company, were real operators with confirmed kills in the hundreds, but the majority were anonymous. They didn't become heroes of the Soviet Union. They just did the job, died quietly, or survived without recognition. The inclusion of women in combat roles, particularly as snipers, was revolutionary for its time. The Soviet Union, alone among the major combatants, mobilized women on a massive scale for front-line combat roles. Over 800,000 women served in the Red Army during World War II, including as pilots, tank drivers, machine gunners, and snipers. This wasn't merely a matter of ideology. It was a practical response to desperate manpower shortages. But it also revealed a pragmatic approach to utilizing human resources that other armies lacked. Women snipers often proved exceptionally effective. Their generally smaller stature made them easier to conceal, and many instructors noted that female students tended to be more patient and methodical than their male counterparts. They were less prone to the bravado that could lead to unnecessary risks, and more willing to wait for the perfect shot rather than taking a low-percentage attempt. Psychological studies conducted after the war suggested that women also adapted more quickly to the emotional demands of sniping, though the reasons for this remain debated. And in October 1942, 24 of them were told to hold a forest. The Orlovka salient was a nightmare of overlapping defensive lines northwest of Stalingrad proper, a place where the Volga River bent east and left a series of ravines, gullies, and patchy forests jutting into German-held territory. By October, the salient was collapsing. The 62nd Army, commanded by Vasily Chuikov, was holding Stalingrad itself by pure stubbornness. But the flanks were crumbling. German forces were pushing south and east, trying to cut off the remaining Soviet positions from supply routes across the Volga. The broader context of the Stalingrad campaign was one of unprecedented brutality and strategic importance. Since the Germans had reached the city in August 1942, fighting had devolved into some of the most intense urban combat in military history. Every building, every street, every sewer line became a battlefield. The Soviet 62nd Army, reduced to a fraction of its original strength, was hanging on by a thread, supplied only by perilous crossings of the Volga under constant German fire. The Orlovka salient represented a critical vulnerability in the Soviet defensive line. It protruded into German-held territory, creating a bulge that was difficult to defend and which threatened the security of supply routes to the north. If the Germans could break through here, they could potentially roll up the entire northern flank of the 62nd Army, cutting off reinforcements and supplies and precipitating the collapse of the defense of Stalingrad itself. One of those routes depended on a road junction that ran through a stretch of forest the Soviets called the Pocket. It wasn't a major road. It wasn't strategically decisive in the grand sense. But it mattered because it was one of the last covered approaches to a ferry point. Lose that junction, and Soviet forces further north would have to retreat across open ground under German observation, which meant they wouldn't retreat. They'd be destroyed. The forest itself was thin, sparse, mostly birch and pine, already losing leaves in the October cold. The ground was uneven, broken by old shell craters, fallen logs, and shallow irrigation ditches from a pre-war collective farm. Visibility varied wildly. Some sight lines ran 300 meters, others closed down to 30. It wasn't good tank country, it wasn't good for massed infantry, but it was perfect for snipers. The terrain characteristics of the pocket created what modern military theorists would call a death ground for conventional forces, but an ideal environment for small unit tactics. The irregular sight lines prevented effective use of machine guns, which require clear fields of fire. The broken terrain made coordinated movement of infantry units difficult, forcing soldiers to expose themselves as they navigated obstacles. The thin tree cover provided insufficient protection from artillery but ample concealment for individual riflemen. In essence, the forest negated many of the advantages of a conventional combined arms force while amplifying the effectiveness of individual marksmen. The Soviet defenders initially numbered around 60 men, remnants of a rifle company that had been mauled in earlier fighting, a few combat engineers, a political officer, and a 24-person sniper detachment pulled from 3 different regiments. The snipers had been consolidated under a senior sergeant named Anatoly Chekhov, not the famous writer, just a 31-year-old former schoolteacher from Bryansk who'd been sniping since the winter of 1941. Chekhov had over 100 confirmed kills. He'd survived the encirclement at Kiev, the retreat through Ukraine, and the grinding nightmare of the Stalingrad approaches. He was quiet, methodical, and, according to the one surviving account from a fellow soldier, completely without fear. Not in the heroic sense, in the sense that he seemed to have already accepted that he was dead, and so nothing could frighten him anymore. Chekhov's background was not unusual among Soviet non-commissioned officers who had risen to positions of responsibility in the Red Army of 1942. The massive casualties of the first year of the war had created a leadership vacuum that could only be filled by promoting men who showed aptitude regardless of their background or education. Teachers, factory foremen, collective farm managers, men with some organizational skills and the ability to command respect, found themselves leading soldiers in combat. What made Chekhov exceptional was his mastery of sniping combined with his leadership abilities. He had survived not just through skill, but through an intuitive understanding of battlefield psychology. He knew when to move, when to wait, when to take risks, and when to be conservative. His men trusted him implicitly, not because of rank or authority, but because following his orders kept them alive in situations where others had died. Chekhov's orders were simple: hold the junction until relieved or until the regiment behind them completed its withdrawal. Expected duration: 48 hours. Expected enemy strength: unknown, but growing. Chekhov looked at his 60 men, looked at the forest, and made a decision that would define the engagement. He pulled the sniper teams out of the general defensive line. Instead of integrating them with riflemen in fixed positions, he deployed them in a loose, overlapping screen across the entire sector with strict instructions. Do not defend ground, defend time. Make the Germans stop. Make them call for support. Make them think they're facing a battalion. This deployment represented a sophisticated understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare. Chekhov recognized that the primary value of his snipers wasn't in killing Germans per se, but in creating the perception of a much larger force. By spreading his teams across a wide area and carefully controlling their rate of fire, he could create the impression of multiple defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire. The key was restraint, firing just enough to inflict casualties and sow confusion, but not so much that the Germans could pinpoint their locations. He gave the rest of the infantry, the regular riflemen, the engineers, orders to prepare fallback positions deeper in the pocket but to hold fire unless directly assaulted. Their job was to be invisible. The sniper's job was to be everywhere. 24 shooters, 12 pairs, 4 square kilometers of forest. The Germans came the next morning. The attacking force was the 2 Battalion of the 389th Infantry Regiment, part of the 389th Infantry Division, a unit that had fought through France, Yugoslavia, and now deep into the Soviet Union. It wasn't an elite formation, but it wasn't green either. These were experienced soldiers who understood urban combat, who'd cleared Soviet positions in Stalingrad's factory district, who knew how to suppress and maneuver. They expected resistance. They expected a firefight. They expected to take the forest by mid-afternoon. The 389th Infantry Division had a reputation for reliability and effectiveness within the German 6th Army. It had performed well in the initial push toward Stalingrad and had been involved in some of the heaviest fighting in the city's northern suburbs. The WWII Battalion, under the command of Oberstleutnant Heinrich Müller, was considered particularly capable. Müller himself was a veteran of the Western Front campaigns, a professional soldier who had risen through the ranks and who understood both the tactical and psychological aspects of leading men in combat. The German soldiers of the battalion were a mix of veterans from earlier campaigns and newer replacements from Germany. They were well equipped with standard German infantry weapons, Kar 98K rifles, MG-34 machine guns, MP-40 submachine guns, and a complement of mortars and light artillery support. They were confident in their training, their equipment, and their officers. They had successfully assaulted Soviet positions before and expected to do so again. The lead companies moved out at 0700 hours, advancing in open skirmish lines with squad intervals of 5 to 10 meters. Standard doctrine. Platoon leaders stayed close to their men. Machine gun teams followed in the second wave. Mortar observers moved with the forward elements, ready to call fire. Everything textbook. The German tactical approach was sound and reflected the lessons learned from 2 years of combat on the Eastern Front. The open skirmish line provided flexibility and reduced vulnerability to artillery and machine gun fire. Keeping leaders forward allowed for rapid decision-making in response to changing conditions. The integration of heavy weapons in the second wave ensured that once a foothold was established, it could be quickly reinforced and expanded. It was exactly how the German army had been trained to attack. The first shot came at WWII, a lieutenant, 32 years old, moving between 2 squads, 1 round, through the chest. He dropped without a sound. The men around him hit the dirt, scanning the tree line. Nothing. No follow-up fire. No muzzle signature. The forest was silent except for the wind. After 2 minutes, the platoon sergeant ordered them forward again. At 0729, a machine gunner took a round through the neck. He'd been setting up his MG-34 behind a fallen log, his head visible for maybe 3 seconds. 1 shot. He collapsed into the gun. This time, the squads didn't wait for orders. They went to ground and started putting suppressive fire into the trees. Rifles, submachine guns, the remaining machine gun, everything. They fired for 20 seconds. The only thing that moved was bark splintering off tree trunks. They advanced again. At 0741, a radio man went down, then a squad leader, then another rifleman. 5 men in 30 minutes, all single shots, all from different directions. The Germans called for a mortar barrage. Tubes fired. Shells walked through the forest, shredding trees, throwing up mud and splinters. The German infantry pushed forward under the barrage, using the noise and smoke as cover. They gained 50 meters. And then the mortars stopped, and the shooting started again. Chekhov's teams operated on a cycle that was drilled into every Soviet sniper from their first day of training. Shoot, move, hide, observe. Never fire more than twice from the same position. Never silhouette yourself. Never stay visible longer than 3 seconds. And most importantly, patience is ammunition. Each pair functioned as a single organism. The spotter used binoculars to identify targets, estimate range, watch for wind shifts, and scan for return fire. The shooter controlled breathing, calculated lead if the target was moving, and squeezed the trigger between heartbeats. After the shot, both moved immediately, not running, not making noise, but low crawling or slipping through underbrush to a pre-selected secondary position 20 or 30 meters away. There, they would wait. Sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes an hour. Waiting for the Germans to bunch up again, to send out a runner, to let an officer expose himself while pointing. The Mosin Nagant 9130 sniper rifle was not a sophisticated weapon. It was a bolt-action design from the 1890s fitted with a PE or PU scope of middling optical quality. Accuracy was decent, capable of hitting a man-sized target reliably out to 400 meters, sometimes further in the right hands. But the rifle was heavy, the bolt was stiff, and the scope fogged in cold weather. What made it effective wasn't the technology, it was the shooter. Soviet snipers trained with the Mosin until they knew exactly where the rifle would place a shot at any range, in any wind, with any ammunition batch. They memorized the trajectory like a pianist memorizes scales. The rifle became an extension of intent, and in that forest intent was everywhere. One of the sniper pairs, a 23-year-old woman named Klavdia Kalugina, and her spotter, a teenage boy named Grigory, whose last name no surviving record preserves, held the northern edge of the pocket. Klavdia had 61 confirmed kills before October 1942. She'd been a competitive shooter before the war, part of a regional marksman club in Leningrad. When the war came, she'd volunteered, been sent to sniper school, and deployed in early 1942. She was small, maybe 5'2", with a face that her fellow soldiers said looked permanently tired. She almost never spoke. Grigory did most of the talking when talking was needed. Klavdia's background was typical of many of the women who became snipers. Before the war, she had worked as a librarian in Leningrad, spending her days among books and her weekends at the shooting range. She had discovered her talent for marksmanship almost by accident. A friend had invited her to try shooting, and she had proven naturally adept. By 1940, she was competing in regional tournaments and had won several medals. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, she didn't hesitate to volunteer, seeing it as both her duty and a way to use her unusual skill. Their sector covered a natural approach between 2 low ridges where the Germans would have to pass if they wanted to flank the main Soviet line. Klavdia and Grigory set up in 3 rotating positions, 2 in the underbrush along the western ridge, 1 in a shallow crater 30 meters south. They moved between them every 15 minutes, sometimes without firing a shot, sometimes taking 1 carefully chosen target per cycle. In the first 2 hours of the engagement, Klavdia killed 6 men, an officer pointing toward the tree line, a forward observer crouched with a radio handset, a squad leader gesturing his men forward, a machine gunner trying to reposition, a medic running toward a wounded soldier, another officer, this one older, maybe a company commander, standing too long while studying a map. Each shot was under 300 meters. Each was a single round. Each was a kill. She never fired twice from the same spot. Grigory tracked German reactions, how long before they resumed advancing, where they concentrated their return fire, whether they were calling for artillery. After the sixth kill, he whispered that the Germans were starting to move more cautiously. Klavdia nodded. That was the point. By 1,000 hours, the German advance had covered less than 200 meters into the forest. Casualties were mounting, but more devastating than the casualties was the psychological friction. Soldiers were hesitating. Officers were staying low. Machine gun teams were refusing to move into exposed positions. The forest felt alive with invisible death. Radio intercepts later showed that German platoon leaders were reporting heavy resistance and concealed defensive positions, estimates that inflated the Soviet strength to between 200 and 300 defenders. There were 60, and most of them hadn't fired a shot. German doctrine for dealing with dug-in defenders was overwhelming firepower followed by rapid assault. But that doctrine assumed you could see the defenders. It assumed they stayed in place. It assumed that if you hit them with enough high explosive, they'd either die or break. Snipers didn't dig in. Snipers moved, and high explosive was useless against an enemy who wasn't there when the shells landed. At 1100, the Germans called in an artillery strike. 6 batteries, 105mm howitzers, firing for 15 minutes. The forest became a thunder of detonations, trees snapping, earth geysering upward. Smoke rolled through the undergrowth, shrapnel screamed through the air. It was the kind of barrage that should have killed everything in the impact zone. Chekhov had pulled his teams back 200 meters before the first shell landed. He'd heard the German radio chatter increase, heard the forward observers calling coordinates. He didn't need to understand German to know what was coming. The snipers crawled into deeper cover, ravines, craters, thick brush, and waited. The riflemen and engineers hunkered in their bunkers and endured. When the barrage lifted, the forest looked like it had been chewed by something massive and indifferent. Trees were shattered. The ground was cratered. Fires smoldered in patches. The German infantry came forward again, this time moving faster, thinking the resistance had been shattered. The snipers moved back into their forward positions and resumed shooting. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. From the German perspective, they'd just dropped 15 minutes of divisional artillery on a target, and the target was still killing them. It shouldn't have been possible. It violated the logic of firepower and attrition. Soldiers began refusing to lead. Junior officers started volunteering to stay back with the support elements. The advance slowed to a crawl, then stopped altogether. By 1300, the Germans had committed a third company to the attack. Reinforcements pulled from another sector, and achieved virtually no gain. Casualties were approaching 80. Officers were screaming into radios, demanding air support, demanding more artillery, demanding anything that would let them move forward without losing 2 men every 100 meters. But air support couldn't see the target. The snipers left no visible signature. They weren't in trenches. They weren't in bunkers. They were just shapes in the underbrush. And shapes don't show up well from a Stuka doing 300 kilometers per hour at 1,500 meters altitude. The Germans dug in and waited for orders. Inside the Soviet pocket, conditions were deteriorating in a different way. The sniper teams were exhausted. Constant movement, constant vigilance, and the adrenaline crash after each shot were taking a toll. Some of the younger snipers were shaking. One pair had gotten pinned down by a German machine gun and had to wait 3 hours without moving before the Germans gave up and repositioned. Another pair had nearly been overrun when a German squad stumbled into their hide by accident. They'd killed 2 Germans at point-blank range with pistols and escaped, but the noise had compromised that entire sector. Ammunition was running low. Each sniper had started with 60 rounds. By mid-afternoon, some were down to 20. Chekhov redistributed what he could, pulling ammunition from the regular infantry, but there wasn't much to spare. Food was non-existent. Water was limited. The wounded, there were 3 now, all from shell fragments during the artillery strike, couldn't be evacuated. They were stabilized and hidden in a bunker with instructions to stay silent. And yet morale was holding. The snipers knew what they were doing. They could hear the German confusion. They could see the hesitation. They understood, in a way that infantry under bombardment often couldn't, that they were winning. Not in the sense of destroying the enemy, in the sense of stopping him. Chekhov moved between the pairs, checking positions, offering advice, redistributing ammunition. He didn't give speeches. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, a quiet, solid figure who moved through the forest like he owned it, like the Germans were the intruders and he was simply managing pests. One sniper later recalled that Chekhov never seemed hurried. Even when shells were falling, even when machine gun fire was raking the trees, he moved at the same measured pace, his face expressionless, his eyes always scanning. By 1600, the Germans tried again. This time they brought up flamethrowers, 2 teams, covered by heavy machine gun fire and smoke grenades. The idea was to burn out the suspected sniper positions, force them to move, and kill them in the open. It was a sound tactic. It might have worked. But Chekhov had anticipated it. He'd seen the flamethrower teams moving up during the lull. He'd repositioned 4 sniper pairs into elevated positions with overlapping fields of fire covering the likely approach routes. When the flamethrower teams came forward, screened by smoke but still visible as silhouettes, the snipers opened up simultaneously. 4 shots, 4 seconds apart. 2 flamethrower operators went down. One of the backup carriers took a round through the shoulder and dropped his tanks. The 4th shot hit a fuel tank, not intentionally, just bad luck for the Germans. And the whole thing went up in a roaring fireball that sent black smoke boiling into the sky. The supporting infantry scattered. The attack collapsed. The Germans pulled back again. This time they didn't try to advance. They just held their line and waited for night. Night fighting was a different kind of horror. The Germans knew the snipers were still out there, but visibility dropped to almost nothing under the forest canopy. Moonlight filtered through in patches, creating shadows that moved with the wind, shapes that could be a man or a stump or nothing. The Soviet snipers didn't have night vision. Neither did the Germans. It became a game of sound and patience. Chekhov ordered his teams to stop shooting unless absolutely necessary. The goal now was to hold position silently, let the Germans think the forest was empty, and wait for dawn. Some of the pairs pulled back to the secondary defensive line, where the regular infantry waited. Others stayed forward, dug into shallow scrapes, wrapped in camouflage cloaks, motionless for hours at a time. Klavdia and Grigory stayed forward. They'd found a position inside a collapsed drainage culvert that gave them a narrow view across one of the main approach routes. Grigory took first watch while Klavdia tried to sleep. She couldn't. Her hands were still shaking from the adrenaline. Her ears were ringing. She kept seeing the faces of the men she'd killed, not out of guilt, but just as persistent images burned into her memory by the intensity of focus required to make each shot. She wondered if the shaking would ever stop. She wondered if she'd survive tomorrow. She wondered if it mattered. Grigory tapped her shoulder. She looked where he was pointing. Movement. German infantry, maybe a platoon, moving slowly through the trees, trying to infiltrate forward positions under cover of darkness. They were being quiet, professional, using hand signals. No talking, no lights, just slow, careful movement. Klavdia didn't shoot. There was no point. One shot would give away their position and bring down return fire they couldn't survive. So she watched, memorizing where the Germans were setting up, counting how many, noting which ones looked like leaders. Information for tomorrow. The Germans dug in about 150 meters forward of where they'd stopped at dusk. They were trying to shorten the distance they'd have to cross in the morning. Smart. But it also meant that when dawn came, they'd be well within the sniper's effective range. Klavdia allowed herself a thin smile. Grigory saw it and nodded. They waited for light. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of October morning where your breath mists and your fingers go numb if you don't keep moving them. The Germans began their attack at 06:30, earlier than the day before, trying to use the low light to mask their advance. It didn't work. The snipers had night-adapted vision. The Germans didn't. For the first 10 minutes of the attack, the Soviets could see the Germans better than the Germans could see them. The killing started immediately. Officers, radiomen, machine gunners, grenadiers carrying satchel charges, anyone important, anyone whose death would disrupt the attack. By 0700, the German assault had stalled again. By 0730, they'd pulled back to their start line. Casualties for the morning, 42. Ground gained, 0. The regiment's commanding officer, an Oberstleutnant named Heinrich Müller, a decorated veteran who'd been with the division since France, radioed division headquarters and requested permission to withdraw. The response was unequivocal. Take the forest. The road junction was needed. The attack would continue. Müller tried a different approach. He pulled back his infantry and called in every piece of artillery he could reach. Divisional guns, Corps' assets, even a battery of 150mm howitzers that had been designated for a different sector. He was going to obliterate the forest. If he couldn't dig the Soviets out, he'd bury them. The barrage began at 0900 and lasted for 45 minutes. It was the heaviest bombardment the pocket had endured. Shells fell in a rolling pattern, north to south, chewing through the forest in overlapping waves. Trees disappeared. The ground heaved. Fires started everywhere. The noise was a physical thing, a pressure that made thought impossible. Chekhov's snipers rode it out in the deepest cover they could find. Some pairs had to abandon their primary positions when direct hits collapsed their hides. 2 snipers were wounded by airburst fragments, one seriously through the abdomen, the other less so, a deep cut across the shoulder. The rest endured. And when the barrage stopped, they moved back into position and kept shooting. The German infantry came forward for the 4th time at 9:50. They advanced through smoke and burning timber, over shattered logs and fresh craters, into a forest that looked like the surface of another planet. They were sure, absolutely sure, that nothing could have survived. The first man died at 0951, a sergeant, hit through the head while vaulting a fallen tree. Then another, then another. The advance stopped as if it had hit an invisible wall. This was the breaking point, not because of casualties, though the regiment had lost over 200 men by now, but because of the fundamental psychological collapse that happens when soldiers realize that nothing they do matters. They'd tried speed, they'd tried caution, they'd tried suppressive fire, artillery, flamethrowers, night infiltration, overwhelming bombardment. None of it had worked. The Soviets were still there, still shooting, still invisible, still killing. Soldiers began to refuse orders, not loudly, not in open mutiny, just quietly, passively. An officer would order an advance, and the men would move forward 10 meters and then stop, finding cover, going to ground, and not moving again no matter what was yelled at them. Sergeants threatened. Officers screamed. It didn't matter. The will to advance had evaporated. At 1100, Müller made the call. He ordered his regiment to halt all offensive operations and dig in. He radioed division and reported that the forest was too heavily defended to take without unacceptable losses, and that he estimated Soviet strength at between 300 and 400 entrenched troops with extensive fortifications and artillery support. Division didn't believe him. They sent a staff officer forward to assess the situation. The staff officer reached the regimental command post, spent 2 hours observing the forest through binoculars, and watched 3 separate attempts to push forward get stopped cold by invisible fire. He went back to division and confirmed Müller's assessment. The attack was called off. The Germans would bypass the pocket and contain it instead, leaving a screening force to prevent a breakout while the main effort shifted to another axis. Inside the forest, the 24 snipers had held for 48 hours. They'd fired fewer than 900 rounds total, an average of 37 per shooter. They'd killed or wounded an estimated 273 German soldiers, including 19 officers and 22 NCOs. They'd stopped a combined arms assault by a veteran infantry regiment supported by divisional artillery and air assets. And they'd done it without losing a single sniper killed in action. 2 wounded, both of whom survived and were evacuated that night when Soviet reinforcements finally arrived and the German screening force withdrew. The story didn't become famous. There was no newspaper article, no propaganda broadcast, no mention in official histories. Chekhov wrote a brief after-action report that was filed somewhere in the archives of the 62nd Army and probably destroyed when German bombs hit the headquarters bunker 3 weeks later. Klavdia Kalugina survived the war, returned to Leningrad, worked as a schoolteacher for 30 years, and died in 1981 without ever speaking publicly about her service. Grigory's fate is unknown. His first name appears in one fragmentary account and nowhere else. Most of the other snipers scattered to different units after the battle. Some died in the weeks that followed, ground down by the endless attrition of Stalingrad. Some survived, accumulated hundreds of kills, and faded into post-war anonymity. Soviet sniper doctrine continued to evolve, and by 1943, the Red Army was deploying sniper detachments as a standard element of rifle divisions. But the core lesson of that October morning in 1942 remained. You don't need to destroy an enemy to defeat him. You just need to make him afraid to move. You need to break the psychological equation that says advancing is safer than staying still. You need to turn the forest, the city, the field into a place where every step might be your last, where you can't see the threat, can't suppress it, can't bargain with it. The Germans knew this lesson intellectually. They had their own snipers, their own long-range marksmen, their own doctrines for disrupting enemy command structures. But they'd built a military culture around speed, firepower, and overwhelming force. The idea that 24 soldiers with rifles could stop 3,000 was outside the scope of their planning. It violated the arithmetic of modern war. And yet it happened. The mathematical reality of what occurred in that forest is worth examining, because it reveals something fundamental about asymmetric warfare that remains true in every conflict since. The German regiment, at full strength, had approximately 3,000 combat personnel. They were supported by artillery, mortars, machine guns, and air support. In a conventional engagement, say, an assault on a fortified trench line, they could have expected to suppress defensive fire through volume, breach the line through combined arms, and overwhelm the defenders through numerical superiority. Standard attritional logic. You lose some men, but you take the objective. The sniper defense inverted that logic. 24 shooters, spread across 4 square kilometers, created a kill zone where forward movement became statistically suicidal, not because of volume of fire, but because of precision. The Germans weren't taking casualties from machine gun bursts that could be suppressed or artillery that could be avoided. They were taking casualties from individual deliberate shots that removed specific people, leaders, specialists, anyone who made themselves visible for more than a few seconds. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. In normal combat, soldiers develop a mental model of where danger comes from. Machine gun nests have positions, mortars have a sound, artillery has a trajectory. You can predict, adapt, find cover, suppress the threat. Sniper fire is different. It's personal, it's surgical, it comes from nowhere, targets you specifically, and offers no warning. You can't suppress what you can't see. You can't maneuver around what has no fixed position. You can only stop moving or accept that movement equals death. The Germans chose to stop moving. And once that happened, once the psychological threshold was crossed where soldiers collectively decided that no order was worth the risk, the attack was over. The regiment still existed. It still had combat power on paper, but it had lost the will to use it. 24 snipers had created a defensive perimeter that would have required a battalion to achieve through conventional means. They'd done it with fewer than 1,000 rounds of ammunition, no fortifications beyond simple camouflage, and tactics that prioritized mobility and patience over firepower. The force multiplier was something like 125 to 1. One sniper holding ground that would normally require 125 riflemen. This is why the Soviet Union invested so heavily in sniper training. This is why tens of thousands of young men and women were pulled from regular units and sent to specialized schools where they learned fieldcraft, stalking, range estimation, and the cold mathematics of killing from concealment. The return on investment was extraordinary. A sniper with 60 rounds could achieve what a rifle company with 6,000 rounds couldn't. But the human cost of that efficiency is less often discussed. Soviet snipers in World War II had one of the highest rates of PTSD among any military specialty, though the term wasn't used at the time, and Soviet military medicine didn't formally recognize psychological trauma as a combat injury. Snipers were expected to be emotionally invulnerable, patient, cold, methodical. The propaganda image was of a stone-faced hunter, racking up kills with mechanical precision, untroubled by conscience or doubt. The reality was different. Snipers saw their targets as individuals in a way that machine gunners or artillerymen didn't. They looked at faces through scopes. They chose who lived and who died, often watching their targets for minutes before firing, learning their habits, their gestures, the way they moved. It was intimate, and intimacy breeds memory. Post-war interviews with Soviet snipers, rare because most refused to talk about their service, reveal patterns of sleeplessness, intrusive memories, emotional numbing, and social withdrawal. Many drank heavily. Many couldn't maintain relationships. Some couldn't hold jobs. The very traits that made them effective snipers, patience, attention to detail, the ability to remain motionless for hours while focused on a single task, became liabilities in civilian life. They couldn't shut it off. They'd sit in parks and instinctively evaluate sightlines. They'd watch crowds and unconsciously rank targets by priority. They'd wake at night feeling certain that someone was stalking them, that they'd left themselves exposed. Klavdia Kalugina, in one of the few documented glimpses of her post-war life, told a colleague that she stopped being able to sleep in silence. She needed noise, radio, traffic, anything, because silence made her think she was back in the forest, waiting for dawn, listening for German movement. She taught literature for 3 decades. She was reportedly a kind and gentle teacher, but she never married, never had children, and never, according to those who knew her, seemed entirely present. Part of her was still in the forest. Part of her was always watching the tree line. This is the unspoken cost of turning ordinary people into hunters. They win the tactical engagement. They hold the ground. They stop the regiment. And then they go home, if they go home, carrying something that doesn't fit back into peacetime. The skills don't transfer. The vigilance doesn't turn off. The memory doesn't fade. And the war doesn't care. The tactical implications of the October 1942 engagement rippled outward through both the Soviet and German militaries, though neither side formally acknowledged the lessons in quite the same way. For the Red Army, it confirmed what frontline commanders already suspected. Properly trained snipers, employed in coordinated teams with clear defensive mandates, could hold ground far more efficiently than traditional infantry in certain types of terrain. Forests, rubble, urban environments, anywhere with broken sight lines and cover. These became sniper country. By late 1943, Soviet rifle divisions routinely included sniper platoons at the regimental level, and sniper schools were graduating thousands of marksmen annually. The Soviet military establishment began to systematize what had previously been ad hoc applications of sniper teams. New field manuals were published, incorporating lessons learned from engagements like the October 1942 forest defense. These manuals emphasized the integration of sniper teams into defensive planning at the earliest stages, rather than attaching them as an afterthought. They also formalized the tactics that Chekhov and others had developed through trial and error. Overlapping fields of fire, coordinated movement between positions, strict fire discipline, and prioritization of targets based on their tactical value rather than ease of engagement. Perhaps most significantly, the Soviet High Command began to view snipers not just as individual specialists, but as a strategic resource. Large concentrations of snipers were deployed to critical sectors of the front, particularly in urban environments where their effectiveness was maximized. During the Battle of Berlin in 1945, for example, the Red Army deployed over 3,000 snipers to the city, creating a defensive network that made even the most determined German advances costly and slow. For the Wehrmacht, the lesson was darker and more uncomfortable. The after-action reports from the 389th Infantry Regiment were studied, filed, and quietly suppressed. There was no doctrinal shift, no widespread acknowledgement that small unit sniper defense could be devastatingly effective. Instead, German units encountering heavy sniper resistance began using increasingly brutal countermeasures, burning entire forests, executing suspected partisans, employing counter-snipers who shot at anything that moved. The Wehrmacht never developed a systematic answer to the Soviet sniper threat, in part because the answer would have required slowing down, which violated the core tenets of their operational doctrine. German military culture was built on speed and aggression. Stopping to clear snipers one by one was anathema. The German response to the sniper threat evolved throughout the war, but never achieved the effectiveness of the Soviet approach. Initially, German commanders attempted to counter snipers with their own specialist marksmen, but the German sniper training program was never expanded to the same scale as the Soviet one. German snipers, while often highly skilled, typically operated individually rather than in coordinated teams, limiting their tactical impact. Later in the war, the Germans developed more aggressive counter-sniper tactics, including the use of dedicated hunter-killer teams, artillery concentrations on suspected sniper positions, and even the deployment of smoke screens to limit visibility. But these measures were reactive rather than proactive, and they never fully addressed the psychological impact of Soviet sniper tactics on German infantry. The result was that Soviet snipers continued to exact a toll far beyond their numbers throughout the war. Every city block in Stalingrad, every tree line in Belarusia, every ruined village in Poland, wherever the Red Army dug in and waited, snipers made the ground expensive to take. The Germans adapted by avoiding certain terrain, by attacking only after overwhelming bombardment, by sending infantry forward in rushes rather than steady advances. But they never solved the problem. You can't solve a problem that requires you to see the enemy when the enemy's defining characteristic is invisibility. In the decades after the war, military historians occasionally stumbled across references to actions like the October 1942 forest defense and struggled to square the numbers with their understanding of conventional force ratios. 24 riflemen stopping a regiment sounded like propaganda. It sounded like the kind of exaggeration that Soviet military hagiography was famous for. Heroic defenders armed only with patriotic fervor, holding back the Nazi horde through sheer willpower. But the German records confirmed it. The 389th Infantry Regiment's casualty logs, filed in the Bundesarchiv, show the losses. The radio traffic, preserved in fragmentary intelligence reports, shows the confusion and frustration. The tactical maps show the lack of progress. Something happened in that forest. Something that didn't fit neatly into theories of firepower and maneuver. What happened was that the Soviets discovered, or perhaps rediscovered because irregular fighters and partisans have always understood this, that fear is a weapon as effective as steel. That uncertainty compounds hesitation, and hesitation compounds casualties, and casualties compound demoralization. That a soldier who dies charging a machine gun nest dies heroically, in a way that military culture can valorize and absorb, but a soldier who dies to an invisible marksman dies absurdly, randomly, in a way that corrodes morale and breeds paralysis. The 24 snipers in the forest didn't just kill Germans, they killed German confidence. They killed the assumption that numerical and material superiority would inevitably produce victory. They killed the idea that the Eastern Front was a place where German tactical competence and firepower would always prevail. And in killing those assumptions, they bought time for the 62nd Army to stabilize its lines, evacuate its wounded, and reposition its forces. Time. That's what the snipers were really defending. Not ground, not a road junction. Time. 48 hours for a shattered regiment to pull back across the Volga without being overrun. 48 hours for reinforcements to arrive. 48 hours for the larger battle, the grinding apocalyptic struggle for Stalingrad, to shift in ways that would ultimately decide the war. And they bought it with patience, precision, and an understanding of how fragile the will to fight really is when every step forward might be your last. There's a tendency in modern military analysis to focus on technology, on weapons systems, on the interplay of armor and air power and artillery. The Eastern Front is often understood through the lens of T-34s and Tigers, Katyushas and Stukas, the vast mechanized clashes at Kursk and the Dnieper. And those things mattered. They decided battles, shaped campaigns, determined the strategic outcome. But wars are fought by people, and people are more complicated than machines. People hesitate, people calculate risk, people decide, consciously or unconsciously, that an order isn't worth their life. And when enough people make that calculation at the same time, the attack stops, no matter how many tanks are waiting in reserve. The 24 snipers in the forest understood this, though probably not in those terms. They weren't philosophers or theorists. They were soldiers doing a job under impossible conditions, trying to survive until tomorrow, following orders because that's what you did. But in following those orders, in taking their rifles and spreading out across 4 square kilometers of frozen forest and waiting for Germans to appear in their scopes, they demonstrated something that every insurgent, every guerrilla fighter, every asymmetric combatant since has understood. You don't need to match your enemy's strength to defeat him. You just need to make victory more expensive than he's willing to pay. The German regiment could have taken that forest, eventually, with enough artillery, enough time, enough willingness to absorb casualties. But the cost would have been prohibitive, and the benefit marginal. So they stopped. They contained the pocket and moved on. And the 24 snipers slipped away in the night, moving to the next sector, the next defensive line, the next anonymous patch of ground that needed holding. They didn't get medals, most of them, didn't get recognition, didn't get their names in the history books. They got another mission, and another after that, until the war ended or they died, which for most of them came down to the same thing. There's a photograph, poorly preserved and barely legible, buried in a Russian military archive that might show some of the snipers from the October 1942 engagement. It was taken in November, a few weeks after the battle, somewhere in the ruins of Stalingrad. A group of 15 or 16 soldiers, most of them young, sitting in what looks like a destroyed apartment building. They're holding rifles. Some have scopes. A few are smiling, but most aren't. They just look tired. The photograph has no caption, no identification, no notation about where it was taken or who's in it. It's just one of thousands of images documenting the faceless mass of Soviet soldiers who fought through Stalingrad. But the rifles are Mosin Nagants with scopes. And the hollow, watchful look in some of those faces is the look of people who've spent too long staring through optics at other people, waiting for the right moment to squeeze a trigger. Maybe Klavdia is in that photograph. Maybe Chekhov. Maybe Grigory. Probably not. Probably they were somewhere else by then, or dead, or simply never photographed. But the image stands as a kind of monument to all of them. The anonymous hunters who turned the Eastern Front into a place where every tree line, every window, every shadow might contain death. The Soviet Union produced over 100,000 trained snipers during World War II. They're credited with somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million individual kills, though the real number is probably unknowable. Some of those kills decided battles. Most didn't. Most were just one more German who wouldn't make it home, one more name in a casualty report, one more reason for the soldier next to him to hesitate before crossing open ground. And in aggregate, across 4 years and 2,000 miles of front, that hesitation mattered. It slowed offensives. It disrupted timetables. It forced the Wehrmacht to expend resources clearing positions that should have been easy to overrun. It turned the Eastern Front into a meat grinder that consumed the German army division by division, offensive by offensive, until nothing was left but exhausted remnants holding a collapsing line. 24 snipers didn't win the war, but they held one forest for 2 days. And in holding it, they embodied the logic that would ultimately define the Soviet victory. Make the enemy pay for every meter, and eventually he'll run out of soldiers before you run out of meters. If you ever find yourself looking at histories of the Eastern Front, you'll see the big names: Stalingrad, Kursk, Operation Bagration, the great sweeping campaigns that fill entire books. You'll read about Zhukov and Chuikov and Rokossovsky, about the strategic genius of deep operations, and the tactical brilliance of Maskirovka. You'll see the numbers, the millions dead, the thousands of tanks destroyed, the apocalyptic scale of industrial age total war. What you won't see, usually, are the small stories. The 24 snipers in a nameless forest, the regiment that stopped for reasons nobody could quite articulate. The 2 days that bought time for decisions made elsewhere by people who never knew those snipers existed. But those small stories are the war. Not the grand narratives, not the sweeping offensives. The war is Klavdia Kalugina lying motionless in a drainage culvert for 6 hours, watching German soldiers through a scope, deciding who lives and who dies based on 3 seconds of visibility. The war is Anatoly Chekhov walking calmly between sniper hides while shells fall, redistributing ammunition, giving quiet advice, embodying a kind of calm fatalism that kept his soldiers functional when everything else was chaos. The war is Grigory, whoever he was, wherever he ended up, whispering coordinates to Klavdia in the dark, watching her back, being the reason she survived to take another shot. Those are the people who stopped the regiment. Not through courage, exactly, though courage was involved. Not through heroism in the propaganda sense. They stopped it through competence, through training, through an understanding that the job was to hold time, not ground, and that every German who hesitated was a victory even if no bullet was fired. The forest is gone now, probably cleared in the decades after the war, replanted, turned into farmland or industrial development, or simply left to regrow wild. The road junction doesn't exist anymore. The irrigation ditches are filled in. The shell craters have eroded. There's no monument, no plaque, no indication that anything happened there. But for 48 hours in October 1942, that forest was the most dangerous piece of ground on the Eastern Front, not because of fortifications or firepower, because of 24 people with rifles who understood that war isn't won by the bravest or the strongest or the most numerous. It's won by the ones who refuse to let the enemy move forward, no matter the cost, no matter the odds, no matter how invisible and alone and terrified they are in the dark. They held. The regiment stopped. Time was bought. The war continued. And in the great ledger of the Eastern Front, their names are nowhere, their actions unrecorded, their sacrifices uncounted. Just another fragment of the vast anonymous weight that ground Nazi Germany into dust, which is exactly how they would have wanted it.